It is a great honor to welcome Professor Everett Fox to this podcast. He is the professor of Judaic and Biblical Studies at Clark University, and he has also been the translator of the Hebrew Bible. Everett, welcome to the show. How are you?
So nice to be here.
Yes. You've mentioned in our email correspondence that you have a lifelong interest in classical music, in particular 19th century European.
Yes.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I grew up with an older sister who did some singing and also was a music major in college. And I went to a high school in New York City called the High School of Music and Art, which, in addition to an academic program, also was heavily invested in the arts. So between the family and the schooling influence in the 50s and the 60s, that really kind of set a foundation for me. And it felt like what I was attracted to.
Hmm. Yes, and of course, in particular, you enjoy listening to 19th century music.
As
So
it turns out.
yes, so I wonder what makes the great classical pieces of the 19th century different from, say, that of the 18th or the 17th.
Well, probably a greater emotional expressiveness, but also, also in many cases, adherence to a form and a structure.
Hmm.
So that it depends, of course, on the composer, but with Beethoven or Brahms and those who cared about structure, you're in a sense following a text, you're following a narrative. It can't really be put into words, but there is a kind of logical progression. And
Hmm.
so it's something that feels somehow compatible for me.
I see. Yeah. So I'm currently residing in Budapest, Hungary right now, and Hungary has given us a couple of great composers. There's Liszt and then there's Bartók. So, your
For
opinion on that?
sure, for sure. And many great performers
Hmm.
still.
Oh yeah, yes,
So it's somehow ingrained. I have a little bit of Hungarian ancestry, I suppose you could say. So maybe that's in the blood. I don't know. I had a grandfather whom I didn't know who was a bit of a musician, and two of his sisters were pianists. So there's some genetic component, I suppose.
I see. Okay. So, I'd like to focus this hour on the languages of the Bible. So, I'd like to first ask you, in both the Old and the New Testament, what were the original languages?
95% of the Old Testament biblical Hebrew, and New Testament, which is not my expertise, a form of Greek, not so much literary Greek, but a more everyday kind of Greek.
Okay. So, I suppose we'll be uh, sticking to the Old Testament or the
Yeah.
Hebrew Bible at this point.
Yes.
Um, I actually had the honor to interview Robert Alter of
Hmm.
UC Berkeley some time ago, and he did
Sure.
a massive and astonishing translation of the Bible.
Right.
So I wonder, to what extent is your method of translation different from that of Professor Alter's?
Mine is perhaps um, closer in form and expression to the Hebrew, which means I will bend English more than he is willing to do. He has a kind of nice compromise between the Hebrew and the English, whereas as I want to push the reader even further
Mhm.
into some of the ways the Bible speaks. And I always think of translation work, and certainly mine, as a kind of performance, which is a musical model, and that of course can change. So I think that my work tends to be a little more startling than his is.
Mhm.
um, but I think we both read the Hebrew in similar ways, that in terms of what we're looking for.
Yes.
I'm perhaps a little bit more concerned with sound and rhythm as crucial, but he pays attention to that as well.
Mhm. So, what are some of the differences between Biblical Hebrew and English that would make a translator, challenged by the translation process?
Sure. Well, for one thing, Biblical Hebrew does not have a lot of adjectives
Mm,
or a lot of adverbs, the way English does. You can describe almost anything in English in terms of emotion and feeling. Biblical Hebrew works mostly with verbs, and so you have to intuit, you have to guess, what the tone is, and that, of course, presents challenges in reading out loud, to the same extent, perhaps, that an actor has. Although an actor may have more indications of how to do things. I listened some months ago in preparation for a class to a scene in Shakespeare's King Lear, famous scene on the heath. He's in this wild place in the middle of a terrible storm, and so I watched 4 or 5 different famous actors doing that scene, and of course it was very different. Some of them just recited it. Others, like Ian McKellen, who I think was the best, shouted it and put emphasis on the words. So it begins, blow winds and crack your cheeks. Well, you can emphasize the crack your cheeks, these hard consonants, or you can just do blow winds and crack your cheeks. It's a
mm,
very different feeling. And we have the same problem with the Bible, except it's much worse because there's no punctuation and there's really no indication. Famous example toward the end of Job, where God finally answers him. I think most readers agree that God is being sarcastic. So you have to really read it that way. Where were you when I created the world? That's very different than some other possibilities. So that's one of the challenges for me that's embedded in partly the language and partly the text. We don't get a lot of indications of how to do it. Also, the verbal system in Biblical Hebrew is not the same as many modern languages with past, present, and future. It's a little more vague than that. And so you sometimes have to tease out what you think they're getting at. But again, it's the same thing with a piece of music. If Verdi says forte, loud, is that the same as when Beethoven says it or Mozart says it? And so you have to know a little bit about the period, but also intuit, what works with the piece. So I'm concerned largely with pieces like that.
mhm. Yes. I'm a great admirer of Shakespeare, and Lear is one of my favorite of his
Yeah, it's
plays.
quite astounding.
Mhm. Yeah. So, what would be the English translation of the Bible that was used in Shakespeare's time?
That would be, I think it was called the Bishop's Bible, if I remember correctly. There was a Geneva Bible and a Bishop's. I'm pretty sure it was the Bishop's Bible, which was a revision of earlier work of William Tyndale.
Mm,
And the King James Bible, the famous one in English, is about 70% Old Testament Tyndale.
oh,
So they revised what he did, but Shakespeare certainly knew his Bible. Some people think that he may have contributed to the King James translation, which of course was done toward the end of his career, maybe around the time he wrote Lear. I'm trying to remember when that was. So some people think he participated in the translation of Proverbs, but we're not 100% sure. But it's the same, of course, it's the same period and those same great rhythms.
mhm,
The greatest years of English, I suppose some people would argue.
mhm. Yes. I use the King James Bible frequently. I'm a Christian, and
Mhm.
I use it for my consultation.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be my go-to English translation, aside from the ones in my native language, which is Vietnamese.
Mhm.
Yeah, tell me about the history of the King James version.
Well, there are a number of fine books about this, but King James, of course, came to the throne right after Elizabeth. He was James the Sixth of Scotland. He became James the First of England,
Mm.
and he commissioned a group to, as the first page, as the title page said, that the Bible, this translation, was appointed to be read in churches. So the sound of it obviously was very important, and he had quite a few very good Hebraists in England at the time. There was one who was not on the committee. I can't remember his name, but he was perhaps the greatest of all those scholars, but he was an impossible personality. Nobody could deal with him. So they left him off the committee, which is maybe too bad or maybe not. But it's the first of many translations that has been done by committee, and that of course has its pluses and its minuses. Started in 1607, published in 1611. It took a while to catch on. People were fond of some of the things they had, but it holds up pretty well in the sense that you can mostly understand it, which is amazing given that it goes back 400 years. But of course, there are words that change. And that's one of the things that a translator has to watch out for is change in the language, even during one's own lifetime. Uh, so I'm very happy that I get the opportunity to change things. And I can do that because my work is now online through a website called Safaria, a website that has Jewish texts, and I can send an email in the morning, and then by the next day, something that I have discovered is wrong or I don't like anymore, I can change it. Whereas when you're stuck to the printed page, then that's a problem. One of the famous King James printings a few decades later had a interesting typographical error which said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." This is known as the Wicked Bible, and it put the publisher out of business. They couldn't tolerate that. But it is, as you say, the go-to translation, not always correct, and its tone is perhaps a little bit more elevated than the Hebrew is. The Hebrew is a little more earthy, but it's still very compelling, you know. When you have lines like, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Well, we don't use keeper anymore for people. We use it for, animals in a zoo. Somebody is a zookeeper, but it's very hard to get rid of, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Because everybody understands what's going on there,
Mhm.
the
Yes.
emotional content. So these are some of the problems.
Mhm. Yes. Tell me about what the original Hebrew line would say regarding that line in Genesis, I believe.
Well, the word, is a general verb that means to guard or to keep.
Mhm.
Am I responsible for my brother? I mean, it's the same thing that older children have said to parents for many millennia. Why are you, am I responsible for my younger brother? And the answer, of course, is yes. But so, am I my brother's keeper does reflect the original. You could say, am I the watcher of my brother? Am I supposed to take care of him? So it's accurate. It's just the question of the tone.
Mhm. Yes. And of course, it's amazing too that we still understand Shakespeare's text,
Yeah.
even if
So I
they're.
have to say, if you're going to put on a Shakespeare play, you need a person to tell the actors how words have changed
Oh.
and how to pronounce them. It's and I actually one of my sons does that for a living or did it for a long time in Washington at the Shakespeare Theater. He was the dramaturg who told
Mhm.
the actors what they were saying.
Mhm.
And some of the same is true in the Bible. So I don't think you can do a Bible translation without notes of some kind. It's just too many things that are strange to us. And you know,
I see. I heard that the first English translation of the Bible is called Douay Rhymes or Reams. So is that the case?
that is actually a French translation originally.
Oh, okay.
It's a specifically Catholic translation, and I suspect it was in reaction to all these earlier English translations, which were of course Protestant. Tyndale himself was arrested and executed by the church on the continent when they found out what he was doing.
Mhm.
But then very soon thereafter, his work was published or expanded. But the Douay-Rheims is a Catholic translation, and so the English one that's based on that, I don't know to what extent it is based only on the French. I suspect it's a combination of ancient and this French version.
Mhm. So how would the Catholics and the Protestants translate the Bible differently?
For one thing, the order of the books
Mhm.
and the number of books. So some books are included in one tradition or another, especially the so-called apocryphal books like Susanna and the Elders and so on. So there's some difference there, and there are some passages trying to think of a good example, and of course it escapes me at the moment. But there are some subtle differences. I mean, in English, there's for instance, the Revised Standard or the New Revised Standard version, and that's largely a Protestant translation, but not exclusively, whereas the New American Bible is a Catholic translation. I think it has, in a way, more to do with the notes and the accompanying material than the translation itself. Um, the Protestant Bibles end with a reference to the great and terrible day of the Lord. So it ends with prophets. Um, Catholic Bibles have, as I say, the several other books. So it gets complicated.
I see. So did a canon of biblical texts exist before the time of Jesus?
Probably not.
Mhm.
Although the first two parts, the Torah, the five books of Moses, and the narrative and the prophets probably were. I mean, they were certainly finished, and they were probably considered sacred before the time of Jesus. But the canon doesn't get closed of the Old Testament until maybe around the year 200.
Mhm.
So it takes a while, and we don't know the exact process. We don't know exactly who did it, but it's clear that the door is shut. And of course, once the door is shut, then we begin interpreting, and that's a whole other, or as I would say, performing in a way. Um, you know,
Mhm.
it took a while. It took a while to happen, apparently.
Mhm. Now, I know that the five books of Moses are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So tell me about their place of significance within, I suppose, Judaism.
Well, in Judaism, they are the basic text, the Torah, the teaching,
Mhm.
sometimes mistranslated as the law. And so they are the the basis for everything afterwards. They are the fountainhead. So later Jewish law bases itself on the Torah, or at least it refers to them. And of course, you have this interesting dynamic where, on the one hand, you have something like a constitution, and the wording is very important. But on the other hand, times change. And the ancient rabbis found ways to interpret the text of the five books of Moses, not always literally. So, for instance, in the five books, in a number of cases, it's clear that capital punishment exists. If you kill somebody, then you are put to death. Very clear. uh, hundreds of years later, the rabbis in Jesus' time and later decide they don't like that so much. But how do you contradict, a text which is so clear? Well, you find other texts that you can use in a way like a lawyer would use to show that, you have to look at it another way. So even though it's the basis of Judaism, if you found a person who would keep all the laws in the five books of Moses, it wouldn't be Judaism. It would be some kind of uh, combined ancient but not finished product. Famous examples, laws that say if you have a teenage son who is stubborn and doesn't behave towards his parents the way he should, but he curses them and insults them, they take him to the village and the elders decide he is hopeless case, and they take him outside the village and they stone him to death. Well, as far as I know, nobody keeps that anymore, and they haven't for a long time, if they ever did. But it's on the books. So again, how do you deal with these things? Well, you find other ways to read them. It's a little bit like the American Constitution now. Everybody argues about Second Amendment.
Mhm.
Is it okay to keep a high-powered rifle next to your bed? Or were they talking about the 18th century when it took 5 minutes to load a gun and fire one shot? They're still arguing. What is the original text? Is there an original text?
Mhm.
Is there such a thing? And then we get the same problem with music. Is there an original performance practice? If you perform a Beethoven symphony with period instruments and you follow practice in the time, is that correct? Or would he have been happy to hear a modern orchestra with, very enhanced sound? We can't solve these problems so easily,
Mhm.
but that they're performance problems.
Mhm. Of course, we cannot talk about the question of languages without mentioning the Tower of Babel. Um, I believe I asked this to Professor Alter too,
Mhm.
regarding how humanity builds a tower, but God strikes it down, and to prevent the tower from being built again, He gives humans different tongues. So, what is the, I guess, moral slash biblical significance of that in your view?
Well, one of the things that seems to be going on there is in some of these early chapters of Genesis, there's clearly a knowledge of ancient Babylonian stories. And some of the biblical stories uh, reimagine them or recast them in another form. So the tower is very reminiscent of the so-called ziggurats or zikkurats, these pyramid-shaped structures. And the story, in a way, is making fun of them. So it's like saying, here's a great civilization and here is its symbol. But, the word Babylon, which means the gate of the god, is reimagined in the Tower of Babel story as literally Babel, Babble, confusion of languages. So in a way, it's a parody. It's making fun of, it's saying that this great civilization is maybe not so great. And also that people are commanded to spread out over the whole world, and they don't do it. Is there an earlier understanding that they are storming the heavens, challenging the gods? Maybe there's some of that as well. But I think it's these other things that factor in.
So, how is biblical Hebrew different from modern Hebrew?
Modern Hebrew is very much like a European language, past, present, future, adjectives, adverbs. It's not as rhythmic. Of course, we only know biblical Hebrew. We don't have much in the way of other Hebrew at that time, except for bills of sale and letters from farmers and soldiers. But modern Hebrew is a modern functioning language. Biblical Hebrew, a smaller vocabulary, and as I say, different tense system. We know that other literature existed, but it didn't make it into the Bible. There are a couple of places where the text says, if you want to know more about this king, you can look in the Chronicle of the Kings of Judah. And of course, we don't have it. If you can discover it, you will be rich and famous. But so far, nobody's done that. So we just have what we do, a few thousand words. But modern Hebrew is very different. I've met Israelis who've said, well, I can read the Bible because I speak Hebrew. And it's like saying, can your average English speaker read Shakespeare? And the answer is no, not really. If you study, that's different, but just off the top, very difficult. So it's very different. There are some words that are the same, and some expressions, but some of them got changed. There's a passage in Ezekiel his strange vision in the first chapter where he sees something and he describes the color as we think something like amber, like a yellowish color. And when some of the founders of modern Hebrew in the late 19th century were looking for new words, they realized, well, we have to have a word for electricity. Of course, there's none in the Bible. So what did they do? They chose this word in Ezekiel, which describes, a fiery color. And all right, so now if you're in Israel and you call for an electrician, you are calling for somebody whose profession, at least the name originates in the Bible, but with no real connection.
Yes. Tell me about the revival of the Hebrew language. Do you believe that modern Hebrew is the revival of the ancient language or a new language entirely?
I think it's both. I think it uses certainly aspects of the Bible, some expressions, but many of the idioms are also European idioms taken from originally German or French or something like that. So, I mean, it was a decision that the founders of Israel made. Theodor Herzl wanted it to be German, but he was Viennese, and others said it should be Yiddish because many of the founders were Polish and Russian Jews. But in the end, they decided to revive this, and so there is a relationship. I don't know if it's the same as the relationship between modern Greek and ancient Greek. I suspect there are some similarities. Certainly, Italian and Latin are connected, but hardly the same thing. So it's definitely a relationship, but it's not the same.
Yeah. So I was curious about this the other day when I read that Judaism in the Old Testament is a prophetic religion. There's a prophet and there's a caste of priests. But in Jesus's time, it has become rabbis, and there are no priests other than, I suppose, John and Jesus himself.
Mhm.
So what has changed from the times of the Old Testament to the New?
Well, the simplest explanation is that when the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, that was the end of that whole form of religion, and they had the hope to rebuild, and it still exists in Jewish prayers until this day. We look forward to the time of the rebuilding of the temple, but in the meantime, the ancient rabbis said, well, we have to live our lives. So how are we going to do that? No more animal sacrifice. So something will have to substitute for that. And the substitute is two things: prayer and study. Once the Bible is canonized, uh, then you have the same situation as in Christianity and Islam, which is God has given the people the word, the book, the text, and it's their job or their leaders to now understand how to live. No real need for prophets anymore. Now, of course, in the history of these religions, from time to time, somebody arises who claims to be a prophet or is a prophet, and that's people will have to argue that. But basically, they decided that God's word is now in a book, and if you want to know how to live your life, you have to study. You have to master the text, and you have to reinterpret. You have to apply it to your own life. So it's renewing it. And again, the American Constitution does this with amendments. We haven't had one in practically my lifetime now, but they are there. And, so you can see, for instance, in all the decisions and arguments about abortion that, here's a problem. It's not really mentioned in the Constitution. So what are people supposed to do? Well, you see how strongly people feel about that. Life goes on. And rabbis and priests and imams and communal leaders have to decide what's right for their community, and the community has to accept that.
Mhm.
So the Hebrew Bible has a few laws about what to eat and what not to eat, but it's a very short list. So the rabbis came along and they said, okay, well, here's a list of animals, and don't eat milk and meat together, and keep two separate sets of dishes and all kinds of pots and all kinds of things. Not in the Bible, but perhaps in the spirit of the biblical text. So that's an example of how they expanded things. The Sabbath in the Bible, don't go out to the fields as a farmer and work. That's pretty much what it says. It says nothing about going to synagogue or having a family meal on Friday night or lighting two candles or blessing your children. All of these things have become standard Jewish practice, not in the Bible, but perhaps in the spirit of these things. And so that's what happens. It's an evolution, really. It's an evolving process. So are there prophets today? I mean, that's um,
Mhm.
I can't answer that question.
Of course. And I do remember that the last constitutional amendment in America was in the 90s.
Yeah, yeah. I don't even remember what it was anymore. But
Mhm.
for instance, the Equal Rights Amendment,
Yes.
which you would think would be quite simple to pass, still not passed.
Mhm.
So there are cultural things that get in the way. But for most of my lifetime, there have not been that many. I really should do it again because we need to, but the country is too split to do that. You need, I think, two-thirds of the state assemblies. I can't imagine that happening,
Mhm.
but we'll see.
I suppose one of the very I would say exceptional things about the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that
Mhm.
they're all based on texts. Other religions of the world actually are not based on text at all. They're based on a succession of people who have these teachings, and then I guess
Right.
you as a followers have to pass on these things.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's a very different concept. I think most religions agree on, basic forms of behavior and respect for life. Not that they always keep them, but yeah, it is somewhat different. This idea of revelation that God actually talks to people and says, this is what I want you to do, and this is what I want you not to do. It seems very simple, but in reality, not always so easy. So we have elaborate traditions that have grown up for all three religions, and certainly plenty of arguments, sometimes violent arguments about what's right and who's wrong.
Mhm. Yes. I do feel also that as a member of one of the Abrahamic religions, I have a
Mm.
certain obligation to study the other ones, the ones that I personally don't find believing in. So I want,
Yeah,
yeah, from your
makes sense.
view, yeah, from your view, how important it is for, say, someone who's say Jewish to learn the text of Christianity and Islam, and of course the
I
case.
think it's always important because that helps promote the humanity of the other and understanding of the other. And I have to say, my experience in this country indicates that members of these three groups know uh, uh, very little about each other, even though they walk around and talk and do business and everything else. There's really very little understanding, uh, which of course is a problem because it's easy for misunderstanding to arise. And in the age of mass communication, uh, good luck. It's these all kinds of terrible things can appear. So that's a real challenge. Yeah, I think it's very important to to learn about these other ways of looking at things. Um,
So this question may be quite basic to anyone who is a religious Jew, but so in what circumstances can the third temple be built?
well, traditionally, over centuries, Jewish authorities envisioned that as somehow way in the future. They would not have approved of a movement that said, let's leave Europe or let's leave North Africa and go to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. First of all, it wasn't practical because for the last 1,000 years, or most of them, it was the Ottoman Empire ruling. So there was no political reality to it. There are fringe groups in Israel that think the third temple should be rebuilt. They worry me a lot because if you ever wanted a good way to start World War III, that would be the way to start messing with that piece of land. Um, but the the circumstance for the building of another temple would have to be, strictly speaking, the end of history, the end of war, the end of suffering, the end of greed and corruption. In other words, the perfected world. And since we don't seem to be very close to that, this is not an active issue for 90% of Jews. They don't sit around and fantasize about wouldn't it be great to rebuild the temple. Again, there are some fringe groups, but not a good idea in the present world. That's something for the hoped for future, but in the meantime, we have jobs and raise children and deal with the world. So that will take care of itself if it does.
Mhm. So within the Hebrew Bible, there exists not just the Jewish people, but there are also those who are, say, the enemies of the Jews, the Philistines, the Amalekites, I suppose the Canaanites.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean they're enemies. Most of them are enemies in the political sense. They're people who are in the area, and it's not has nothing to do with religion as far as I can see.
yes, that's it. Now, what I was getting at is that did they speak in different languages than, say, Hebrew?
They did, but some of the languages are similar. So Moabite, for instance, Moab is to the east of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. In what's now Jordan, that language has some similarities, and especially in northwestern Syria, just north of Lebanon on the coast, there's a city, or was a city named Ugarit, and in the late 1920s, archaeologists dug up thousands of tablets, clay tablets, with a language called Ugaritic, which is very close to Biblical Hebrew. So it's what scholars call Northwest Semitic. There are certainly many similarities. and even some of the Mesopotamian languages like Akkadian, they either have cognates or there are expressions that mean the same thing. So scholars who master those can really illuminate a lot of the Bible. We have many words that we don't know, like in Job, for instance. So scholars keep trying.
Now, going back to, I guess, cross-religious studies, so whenever you come across, say, a belief, a fundamental belief within, say, another Abrahamic religion, say Christianity's its relationship to Jesus or
Hmm.
Islam's its relationship to Muhammad, that
Sure.
fundamentally contradicts your own beliefs about your
Hmm.
religion.
Hmm.
What would be an appropriate response?
Well, in my view, an appropriate response would be respect for each other. Um, I'm not and an attempt at dialogue. I mean, there are certainly stories, for instance, that can be read together. I've done that sometimes with Christian groups, a story from the Old Testament, and we both learn something. Um, it's not always a simple matter because, for instance, as you know, many of the Old Testament stories are interpreted by Christians to refer in a hidden way to Jesus. So Jonah is in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Well, so that sounds very much like Jesus after his crucifixion. To Jews, that's not a viable interpretation of the story. So again, one group can respect the other, and that has happened in history. But that's all we can do. It's not easy. It's very much like a family situation with siblings, and the old question of whom does mama love more, me or my sister or my brother? And how do you navigate that? For Jews, these other groups are not at the center of what they're doing. For Christians and Muslims, they have gone beyond Judaism. They have superseded it. How do you do that without, bad feeling or violence? And historically, it has sometimes been difficult. But in our world, we need as much respect and kindness as we can find. So that still remains the goal. And there are, of course, fine people out there who do these things.
Yes, and of course the relationship between and Islam is often compared to that of Isaac and Ishmael, right?
Well, as a symbolic thing, sure. I mean, the religions are actually very, very similar in many ways, in terms of the book, in terms of law, in terms of maybe staying away from images and things. And there are some real similarities, and not quite the complicated history that Jews and Christians have.
Mhm. Yes. I've had a chance to see quite a few Islamic art. There's the architecture in was it Isfahan, Iran,
Yeah, yeah,
and
fantastic.
yeah,
Unbelievable.
and the art they use is all patterns,
Yes,
images of humans anywhere.
yes, that's right. I have to say, I mean, I probably couldn't go there today, but in the 1990s, twice I was uh, privileged to visit the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and I have to say it's probably the most beautiful building I've ever seen. It's just breathtaking, and also the great mosque in Morocco and a few other places. Just amazing, really amazing. Not only the geometric patterns, but even the use of the Arabic language as decoration. It's just stunning, you know. So when people are in a spiritual mood and a positive mood, they apparently are able. It's like the great cathedrals of Europe, and elsewhere. Um, So
Yes. So what is the oldest surviving Bible today?
the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yes.
which are not complete, but almost. Yeah, those are the earliest texts that we have. And they're not, I mean, they're old, but they're not as old as we would like them to be. They're third, second century BCE.
Mhm.
But of course, the texts, many of them are much older. So the scribes did their best to preserve things, but they're human, they make mistakes. And so we have to try to navigate uh, that that situation.
Yes, yes, I've heard much about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So how do they verify its historicity?
Of the scrolls themselves,
Yes.
usually chemical means. I don't know if they use carbon dating or something else. Partly through technology and partly through scholars who are experts on the scripts of different periods. So the way in which people form letters, you can sometimes tell the age of a, or modes of spelling. For instance, as you know, there are words in English which add a U after an O, and then you know you're dealing with English people. Whereas without it, it's American. That's very clear.
Mhm.
So there's some spelling things in the scrolls, but I think it's mostly, I don't know if it's spectroscopy or other technology. They can usually tell pretty well when those, and we probably will not find older texts than that because the older ones were written on papyrus from the river, and it's a good writing material, but it falls apart. It doesn't last. So parchment, which is animal skins, can survive mostly, but papyrus does not. So I don't think we'll ever find, 8th century biblical text. That would be astounding. We now have ways of reading text, even if a small scroll is tightly bound together, they can now, read uh, through the scroll. They don't have to unroll it and have the danger of it falling apart. So it's amazing what they can do.
Mhm. So tell me more about the relationship between the Samaritans and the Israelites in the Old Testament. I heard that the Samaritans were formerly, of the Hebrew population, but they broke away because of, say,
Yeah, there were an ancient breakaway group. They only accept part of the Bible, and you will always have in these three religions, you will always have splinter groups that say the official leaders don't do it correct anymore. We want to go back to the original. So there are people who, like early Protestants who said, the Catholic Church is not really in the New Testament, so we have to go back to the way Jesus did it. Or in this case, there were these breakaway Jews who said we only accept part of it. So there is a Samaritan 5 books. It is useful for scholars, but how many Samaritans exist today? I think less than 200. It's a very tiny, tiny group, and they still do animal sacrifice on the holiday of Passover, which Jews do not do. So it's part of this phenomenon of trying to go back to the original. But the truth is that the 5 books of Moses themselves are a composite. They include different points of view. That's kind of the point. So you can't go back to an original, you know. It's like an original performance of a piece of music. It's just one performance, but things change. You mentioned King Lear before. I'll remind you, if you don't know, that in the 19th century, when King Lear was performed, I think in America and maybe in England as well, audiences could not bear the ending because the ending is so bleak and depressing. So they changed the ending. And for decades, King Lear was performed with Cordelia lives, and she and Lear go off into his old age, and he's happy because she's there. Everything's great. Shakespeare would have been appalled,
Mhm.
but there's a need to reinterpret things. Now, of course, we go back to the original. But even with Shakespeare, what's the original text? Is there such a thing? And the answer is really no. He did not publish his plays during his lifetime.
Mhm.
We know that in the theater, the playwright or the director might say, it's really hot tonight, and you can't expect people to stand there for 4 hours. So let's cut scene three. And so many of these plays are never done completely. There's always changes going on. It's dynamic. It proves that it's alive in a way.
Yes. Yes, I learned that too, the how the quarto version of certain plays are different from the folio version as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. And of course, today's is Judaism. It's a multi-sect religion too, right? There's Orthodox, conservative, Reform.
Yeah, and even that is probably too simple. There are subgroups and people who don't define themselves at all. So yeah, there's a lot of variety.
Mhm. Yes, of course. Um, yeah. I think I'd like to end on this note. So you teach Hebrew and biblical studies, and I wonder to what extent are some of your students secular, and how would you account for the secular curiosity towards the
I
Bible?
would say that, yeah, I would say that almost all my students are secular.
Mhm. Oh, wow.
Some of them grew up, and many of them are Christian in background, at least half, maybe more. And they're curious because the Bible's so important in culture, so they want to learn something about that. And partly it's that their religious background was mostly when they were children, and now they are more or less adults, and they want to look at them and see what these traditions are. Some of them are searching, although it's not my job to supply them with a religious tradition. That's not, I'm teaching at a liberal arts university, but it is my job to provide information and to explain what people have done and what they have believed. So they're very open-minded, and they're often very surprised at what they read, usually pleasantly surprised. And they respond especially to this idea that there are many voices in the Bible, that it's not one monolithic work with one point of view, but apparently it invited people from different groups in the society to come together. So it's not a bad model. So yeah, there's always a lot of interest. I mean, they may have read parts of the Bible or heard parts in church and so on, but they like learning about history and how things have changed, and of course, some of the human problems that we have are certainly the same. Even though it's a very different world, but it's still very recognizable. So when Job loses everything that he has and wants to know why he's suffering, even though he's a good guy, I mean that question still bothers everybody. That has not changed at all. So and they're interested also to learn how different traditions approach the Bible. So one of the things that I do, I teach the text as I understand it, but I also spend time on how Jews and Christians have read the Bible. And some of that's familiar to them and some of it's not. But it helps them understand each other, I hope.
Mhm.
Part
So
of them.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So I guess the Bible is a good document of human nature and its permanence.
for sure. For sure. One of the things we did recently when I teach the story of King David and Bathsheba,
Mhm.
the successful king who then has this affair and murders her husband. Uh, several business leaders wrote an article some years ago about what they called the Bathsheba syndrome, where a leader of a corporation or of a country is very successful, and that leads them to be sloppy and not to treat people right. So, some of these same problems certainly still exist. So, human nature apparently has not regressed tremendously, a little bit, but we still need some help.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Everett Fox, for being on this program.
Good. Well, thanks for having me on.